Welcome to the Thought Decoders channel. Here we teach logic, we teach you how to state and clearly defend your faith. I'm Sean Mixon, I'm the Thought Decoder, and today we're going to look at a logical fallacy. It's a part of our ongoing study of logic, of formal logic, and we're looking at a fallacy called denying the antecedent. And what we're going to do now is to do a little review of what we've gone over in the past and see where we can get today in this study of logical fallacies. We've been doing a study in William Lane Craig's book, one of the greatest living Christian apologists, called Learning Logic, and he said that it's a children's book, which is very funny to me because it's a challenging book to wrap your mind around the concepts. It's not that he lays it out in an unclear way, but it's that those concepts are in themselves kind of meaty, right? You're dealing with necessary and sufficient conditions and things like that. So those concepts are kind of inherently difficult to understand in some ways. So today we're looking at denying the antecedent. Let's review. If you look at previous videos that we've done on logic, we talked about conditionals, and they're basically if-then statements, and we can symbolize each part of a conditional. We can symbolize the part of the conditional that comes after the then, and we can symbolize the part of the conditional that becomes in between the if and the comma. Okay, so the first part of a conditional that comes after the if is called the antecedent. So, for example, take the sentence if it rains, then the ground is wet. Okay, so if we look at that sentence, we can see that it rains is bold. It rains would be the antecedent. The ground is wet would be the consequent. It's the part of the conditional statement that comes after the then. See that right there? Okay. So for our example for today, and this should be a pretty short video, but for our example, we're going to take a look at a slide from a debate that Michael Licona did with Dr. Shabir Ali, an Islamicist and a Muslim apologist. So in his opening statement, Dr. Licona wanted to emphasize the importance of the resurrection for Christians, and he looked at he examined Paul's view. He gave this argument that Paul gave, I guess, in one of the books that was written by Paul. Ironically, the form of the argument is logically fallacious. Now, I don't know if Paul gave this argument in the form that Dr. Licona presented it. Maybe he did. I'm just going to take Dr. Licona, just going to assume that he represented this exactly the way Paul argued it in wherever this comes from. I think it comes from Corinthians. One of the books of Corinthians, when they're talking about what body how are the dead raised, and what bodies are they raised with. And so now in logic, we symbolize arguments in symbolic logic, and the way we do that is we take statements like what's in bold right there, and we replace it with a capital letter. There are other symbols that show relationships between statements, like you have like arrows, you have a V that stands for or, You have an upside down V that stands for like combines two statements. It says that both statements on either side of the upside down V, both statements are true. This statement is true and this statement is true. If it's just a V, then it's this statement is true or this statement is true. Right? So it's just different relationships between sentences. We call this sentential logic or propositional logic. It deals with the logic of statements and their relationships. So looking at this conditional, these pluses, these plus signs here, in logic, we formalize arguments in their premise and conclusion form. So the first four premises would be premises within the arguments that lead you logically to the conclusion, and the last two plus signs would be conclusions. Okay, so let's look at how this is set up here. So if Christ was not raised, we will not be raised. Christ was not raised. After the if, I can turn that into the symbol, capital P. Christ was not raised. We will not be raised. I can change that into Q. That comes after the comma, or if there was a then there, it would be after the then. Okay. So now how does that, what's the symbol that shows the logical relationship? Well, it's this arrow here. Sometimes it's a horseshoe. It looks like a backwards C that will be in between this P and this Q. And what it means is read like this. If P, then Q. If P is Q, then true. Q is true. If Christ was not raised, then we would not be raised. Right? So that's premise one right here. And this is how you formalize arguments to see their logic relationships. And you do this when you're examining arguments to see if the person giving an argument is actually giving a valid argument. It's two ways to critique arguments. You can look at the truth of the premises, or you can look at the logic. Or you can go deeper and look at the concepts. Are the concepts within the arguments clearly defined? Right? Are the words that are used in the premises clearly defined? Right? And that's a deeper level. Many times you have a conceptual problem. Like for atheists and theists, a lot of times when we say evidence, we don't mean the same thing by evidence. Sometimes atheists seem to want to say that evidence is all empirical. Right? Anything that you can be, that's observable. So in principle, God, even if he existed, wouldn't be provable because you couldn't observe him with your senses if he was invisible. Right? So God can say, hey, I'm here, but you can hear a sound, and if you can't pinpoint where the sound is coming from, then you wouldn't be able to deduce God on this empiricist viewpoint. Or to say that, like Matt Dillahunty kind of suggested in his debate with Mike Licona, that in order to prove some hypothesis or belief, then you need to be able to test it and to repeat it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another challenge to arguments, is looking at the concepts within the argument to see if those concepts are clear. And I think there's some other ways, but I think those three are the basic approaches. You can say, is this argument, if the premises are true, does it lead to the conclusion? You can say, are the premises true? You can ask something about the concepts within the premises. Are these concepts defined? Are they clearly defined? Do we know what they mean? Is it ambiguity? So on and so on. Right? So we do the same thing to the second plus sign. This would be the second premise. If we will not be raised, this life is all there is. Now, if you look right here, we will not be raised. That's the same premises right here. So we give it the same capital letter. So here we say if P, then Q. Here we say Q. If Q, then here's a different sentence, different statement that is true or false. So if P, then Q. If Q, then R. Q, R, S, T, U, V, like the letters. And for some reason, it's just a convention. It's kind of like which letters and sentences you capitalize and which letters and titles you capitalize. That's a convention of how people use the English language. And within logic, for some reason, when you're formalizing, I don't know the historical significance, but just in many textbooks, when they symbolize arguments, they often use P and Q. I know Alvin Plantinga uses P and Q a lot. The logic textbooks that I've seen, they tend to start out with P and Q, maybe because P stands for, like, premise stands for the word P. You know, maybe that's why. But it's just a guess. But so if P then Q, if Q then R, this life is all there is. Then we go to the third plus sign. It says in that case. Now, in that case there, that's not really clear what the content of in that case is, but it seems like it's doing something like pointing back to some other statement, referring back to the previous statement. So we can just say in that case basically means if this life is all there is. So that's basically making the same statement as the consequence here. This life is all there is. So if P then Q, if Q then R, if R, the Christian life is not worth living. So then we have S here. So if P then Q, if Q then R, if R then S. Okay, so if we look at the way I've symbolized it, that's what you can see. If P then Q, if Q then R, if R then S. Okay, now but Christ was raised. But is a negation, right? It's saying something was stated, but the opposite is true, or consider this, or here's something contrary. Here's something in opposition to what was previously stated. So look right here. Christ was not raised. Christ was raised. These two things are contradictory, right? So here, he's not proving that Christ was raised, right? He's assuming it. That's one of the premises. So this is not an argument for Christ being raised. It's an argument for the significance of living. It's an argument for the significance of Christ's resurrection to our lives. Was Jesus just a moral teacher? Can we be good Christians without the resurrection? And does it really matter? He's saying it's not even worth living if Christ didn't really get up. So that's his point. Like the core of our faith, the Christian belief, is the resurrection of Christ. So let's look at the logical fallacy. Ironically, maybe Paul did do this because, something in Scripture doesn't have to be a valid argument to be inspired by God. The fact that God inspired it is validation enough, is epistemically acceptability enough. It's if something is taught within Scripture based on the teaching principle of inerrancy, then it's valid. And then we look at the resurrection and see the testimony of the disciples, the history, the absence of any contradictory documents saying that Jesus didn't get up by eyewitnesses. All the eyewitnesses, and earliest testimonies and reports we have agree. So this gives us confidence today that Jesus actually rose from the dead. We look at history, we go all the way back to the Apostle Paul, etc., and we have confidence. So this is an argument for the significance of that he got up. It's assuming that the audience that he's writing to knows that he got up. He said, but Christ was raised, right? Therefore, we will be raised, and therefore the Christian life is worth living, right? So now, what's the problem with this argument? Here's the problem. For as saying Christ, it's not the case that Christ wasn't raised. For saying not P, it's just like saying it's not the case that Christ wasn't raised. So, and that's just like saying Christ was raised. So it basically denies the antecedent of the first plus sign right here. If Christ was not raised, we would not be raised. But Christ was raised, right? So what follows from that? We will not be raised? Or it's not the case that we will not be raised. We will be raised, right? So he's trying to argue from the way the argument is formulated. If Paul is not giving a formal argument here in the Bible, in the epistle, but the way Dr. Lacona is presenting it in terms of a formal argument, it is formally fallacious. It is logically fallacious. Let's see if we can understand why. You can't deny the antecedent and expect the conclusion to follow. So here's another example of an argument that denies the antecedent. What if I say, if the ball is green, then it has a color? The ball is not green. Therefore, the ball doesn't have a color. Right? With all the confidence and hubris in the world. Right? If you thought about that, you probably would say, that doesn't really make sense, because just because it's not green doesn't mean it doesn't have a color. So what has gone wrong? Well, the mistake is to confuse necessary and sufficient conditions, right? It's not necessary for a thing to be green to have a color. This cup can not be green, but it can still have a color. Obviously, it's not green, but it still has a color. So this is a counterexample to the truth of that statement. What I'm trying to do, what the arguer or the person who gives that argument is trying to do, is they're trying to make being green a necessary condition of being a color. They're confusing if the ball is green, then it has a color, with if the ball has a color, then it's green. That's really what they're trying to say. Right? That's the logical, true logical form of their reasoning. Okay, so they say if the ball is green, then if the ball has a color, then it is green. But the ball is not green, therefore the ball doesn't have a color. That's really what that reasoning is trying to reflect, but it does it inadequately. So that's a valid argument that I just gave, but it's a unsound one because the premises are false. And it's false because being green is not a necessary condition of something having a color. Right? Otherwise, the only color we would see is green. Everything would be green. Say, oh, look at that color. There would be no such thing as a color. All colors would be green, So I hope that makes sense. So that's why the argument, the way Dr. Lacona has presented it, is logically fallacious. Now look right here. We say, but it's not the case. Christ was raised, right? Christ was raised. So saying Christ was raised is to say it's not the case that Christ was not raised. And in logic, we have a rule of double negation. Anytime I have not T, let T stand for Christ was raised. Well, the premise, the first plus sign, is just like saying not T. If not T, then whatever. So if Christ was not raised, right? So not T. But then we can look at this fourth premise as saying it's not the case that Christ was not raised. It's not the case that Christ was raised. Right? So you denying something that's already been negated, and by the rule of double negation, you can just say T, Christ was raised. So saying that it's not the case that Christ was not raised is just like saying Christ was raised. Those two statements are logically equivalent, given the rule of double negation. Okay? And that's how we deny the antecedent. It is a logical fallacy. You cannot deduce a conclusion by the rules of logic by having a conditional like this and denying you can't derive in your conclusion a denial of a consequent by denying an antecedent, right? So I can't say not P, therefore not Q. I can't say if P, then Q, not P, therefore not Q. That's the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. Okay. So this has been a quick video on a logical fallacy known as denying the antecedent. I thank you for your time and thank you for joining me. If you could do me a favor, like and subscribe and even share this video if you got some value from it. You can share it with other people. You can discuss it yourself. Think about it more. If you have any questions, put a question in the comments. I'll be happy to answer it if I'm capable of it, or referring you to a source where you can get some answers. But I love what I'm doing, and I'm glad you can join me on this journey. Thanks for joining me, the Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder, where I teach you logic and I show you how to clearly state in defense